Welcome to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It's good to see you all this morning. Good morning, Brooke. Good morning, Arya, Monica. Um, Welcome to everybody. Make sure to take a moment, like the video, share it on social media, or email it to some comrades, text it. As Jared Ball at I Mix What I Like says, tell a friend to tell a friend. Um, and yeah, support us on Patreon if you want, or through the super chat. I will say we've been demonetized on a number of videos recently, and if I had to bet, this will be one of them, which is totally fine with us. But yeah, anyways, it's all the more reason to support in other ways if you can or are able. Um, Today we're gonna do our 10th conversation with Abdaljawad Omar since November. And it's nobody I'd rather be in conversation with right now. Um, for those who don't know, Abdaljawad Omar is a writer, analyst, and lecturer based in Ramallah, Palestine. He currently lectures in the Department of Philosophy and Cultural Studies at Birzeit University. He has written extensively in Arabic and English. Abboud has contributed to Electronic Intifada, Mondoweiss, which published the piece that we're going to be talking about for a good bit of this conversation today. Um, and Ebb Magazine, and also just recently over my shoulder here, Material, which you can find on the Foreign Languages Press website. Um, and also, I should say the conversation we had with JMP, Joshua Mufad Paul, also was from that issue. And yeah, all of our conversations with Abdul Jawad can be found now on a playlist that's on our page. And I recommend all of them. They're all about, related but different things. Some are more about analysis of the genocide and the war. Some are more about responding to different pieces from within the Western left, which is some of what we'll be talking about today too. Oh, the mic is in teeny. Thank you, Brooke. Let me fix that. All right. Hopefully that sounds better now. Thank you for pointing that out. All right. I'll wait a second and let me know, audience, if the mic sounds clearer now. Let's see. Other things. I mean, I'll just say as I'm waiting for that obviously today we're going to be talking about the piece, which is the question of Hamas and the left. And we will also, okay, sounds clear now. That's great. All right. I'm going to bring Abdul Jawad Omar to the stage now and we will get into it. Good to see you again, my friend.
Good to see you, Jared. Glad to be with you and everybody watching as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So there is a lot that I'm sure we will want to cover today. The last time we spoke, we discussed some of the pieces that we started this conversation in some ways. Some of the pieces you wanted to respond to with regards to a number of pieces that we've seen recently from different Western leftist kind of thinkers and academics that seek to distance themselves from Hamas, or to demonize other people on the left who are being too supportive, seen as being too supportive of Hamas. And we talked about that a little bit. But since then, you elaborated into a really great piece for Mondoweiss that I mentioned, and shout out to them. They do great work. Definitely people should support their work. The question of Hamas and the left. So you write in this piece, quote, the main dividing line between Palestinian political factions isn't over the schism between secularism and Islamism, uh, the struggle over divergent socio-economic agendas, or the merits of a particular tactic in service of liberation. All those are important issues in their own right, but what is actually causing a rift in the Palestinian political arena is the chasm between a politics of raw defiance and a politics of accommodation, cooperation, and collaboration. So I thought we would start there. Can you just say a little bit more about this? Because I think it's a really important piece for us to understand as we seek to understand what the actual kind of dividing line is within Palestinian society.
Well, yeah, I mean, as you said, the piece came out like from this ongoing discussion that I saw happening, like whether by some people in the Western left and the divergent point of views. And I think that a lot of the discussion was also harkening back to Palestinian politics and dynamics. So, and there I thought that there is a bit of a problem. I mean, I'm not here like trying to and I think I ended the piece just to qualify it with, you can't ground solidarity on a notion of dismissing or overlooking Hamas. It doesn't mean that you have to be fully on board with their social and political program. I mean, that's a different thing. But I think one of the things that I just drew from a lot of that discussion is that there is this tendency to place Hamas on a pedestal where you can basically maintain some sort of moral coherence of condemning both Palestinians and Israeli through this overinflation of Hamas or over exaggeration of Hamas. But also what I think bothered me with a lot of pieces is this talk about Palestinian politics, and I think there I could at least throw my hat into the debate and give some sort of sense on what actually really is the main dividing line in Palestine, and how that dividing line is enacted in the current political atmosphere between the various factions, various political formations that exist, and why is that important as we try to create, or as the Western left tries to create some sort of position vis-a-vis the ongoing struggle in Palestine. What position does it want to take? Does it belong to this moment of this attempt by one of the political parties in Palestine that is still, faithful to the idea of resistance, to break the barriers, deform the colonial regime, and, to open this horizon of possibility? Or is it gonna just look at that horizon of possibility, but at the same time dismiss those who enabled its opening in the first place? So to me, it was important to make that intervention clear. It doesn't mean that Hamas is a progressive political party, or it's trying, at least on leftist terms, trying to transform society into some sort of progressive society. I mean, I'm not trying to claim that, although there's a debate around that as well. In many ways, there are people who have studied a lot of the Islamist political parties, the role of women in it, and they have a much more nuanced view of this whole regression progressive dynamic that exists. And it's not something that I've taken a position on, but it's something that I think I'm uncertain about. But there is that discussion among a lot of those who took the experience of Hamas politically and socially and moved beyond these type of dualities that are enforced upon Hamas through just this prism of a slightly Islamophobic tendency to look at such political formations and their role in society. So there is that much more nuanced debate happening even within academic discourses around to what extent also Islamist movements have some progressive agenda here and there, or to what extent they repeat socially regressive patterns. But I think what was also central is to position that dichotomy between resistance and cooperation, which have informed much of my discussion when I was speaking to you throughout these 10 conversations. If we go back to them, that is one of the elements that I've always trying to explain to people. It's this is this historical conjuncture does not come where necessarily Palestinians are united, even within Gaza, over this agenda of resistance, and particularly perhaps in Gaza now with the wholesale destruction, with many voices voicing different opinions about what has occurred since October 7th, including the role of Hamas in all of this. Now, my issue is that also at this particular juncture, the current imperial colonial powers are all, attempting to destroy Hamas. Netanyahu has declared that Hamas needs to be replaced, destroyed, surrender, and then completely obliterated from any form of politics, whether in historic Palestine. And to me, I think at this particular moment, when the imperial and colonial powers are hell bent on either getting Hamas to capitulate or transform Hamas into some PLO version after Oslo, or in destroying its physical presence and weakening it to the extent of killing this political formation, that it's for me unforgivable that you would be part of this kind of attack on it. It doesn't mean, again, that you need to be fully on board with what Hamas does and doesn't do. But what it means is just that at this moment, especially in the politics of outside Palestine, that there needs to be this kind of nuanced takes on Hamas and a defense of it, a defense of its history, its connection to the wider Palestinian struggle and radical tradition. This idea of also just regurgitating, lines of attack on it, delegitimizing it, and completely, moving it beyond what is conceived as politically feasible, I think is for me problematic, because I do believe, in this kind of Maoist, let's say, position, which is you have to have, a unified front, specifically in these moments of intense struggle. And especially when these moments haven't ended yet, there is a time and a place for perhaps critiques and dealing with actions and other, but this is not the time for it. At least this is my view. People disagree with that, but that's my view. The third element, I think, is that it's important to also say that in Palestinian politics broadly, you can find anybody that echoes any of your fantasies about the conflict. Whether it's Palestinians who have basically become non-Palestinian in at least the forms of identification that they have. And I mentioned in the piece people like Musab Hassan Youssef, for instance, or Joseph Haddad, but I think this is a broader tendency than that, than only those outspoken Israeli propagandists are recruited to provide this kind of, between quotes, native view of how Israel is a great country and how it allows forms of political participation and how its enemies are horrendous and barbaric, etc. And these voices from the natives that come in, but it also spans a lot of the political Palestinian spectrum, whether in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, inside, with Palestinian citizens or Palestinians in 1948, or also in Gaza itself. So that this kind of Sikhism or Shiism is essential to understand that after 100 years of colonialism, there's a lot of things that are deformed in the Palestinian political body, and among them is the will to resist. And absent that will to resist, the space and the cracks open for forms of identification, social arrangement that either accommodate or is willing to cooperate with colonialism in different ways. And in the past 30 years, specifically since Oslo, this has accelerated in many ways, specifically in the West Bank and Jerusalem and in Palestinian communities in 48, where this kind of hopeless futurity of Palestine has also created this tendency among many in the Palestinian intellectual scene, many among the Palestinian national movement, to look for forms of cultural expression, artistic expression that are, move beyond the notion of Palestine. It's like, it's a politics of after Palestine. We failed to, reclaim Palestine. What do we do now? And, what forms of survival strategies do we adopt? And, in many ways that is not only, a negotiated outcome that comes out of, the mix of the apparatus of corrosion and violence that we exist under, the power to arrest and the power to kill, but it also, or just, the incentives that are given to Palestinians, like, neoliberal economic spaces where we can consume, for instance, in the West Bank, and also in Jerusalem and other areas in Palestine, and live this kind of intimate life where, Palestinians are excluded from the ability to actually, have any public say in their own management or affairs or life, and just simply, surround themselves with, notions of a private life, friendship and family and intimate life that, they keep close to themselves as a means to shut down the world around them, and not think about what's going to happen to Palestinian communities in the long term. Do we need to resist or not? And I've mentioned this more than once, that sometimes even resistance itself conjures up, for a lot of people, a disruptive rhythm that at this moment they find within it, also the potentiality for their own, something that stands against either their material interests, specifically from the bourgeois class, or that stands against, the rhythms of life that they got used to and normalized in the broader society. So there is that, there is that element. And I think that as we, progressive revolutionaries, or people who have, a knack for militancy, or, thinking about changing the world, the idea of being in solidarity with Palestine needs to, you need to grapple with this division. You can't be in solidarity, for instance, with a Palestinian Authority that suppresses the capacity to resist. Maybe on some level the Palestinian Authority does some things like legal warfare somewhat, but then, a lot of times it betrays even that. But, there are elements to which Palestinian Authority does enact certain things for its own. I mean, that's another story. I don't want to go into it. For its own survival and legitimation mechanisms here internally. But I think what is central is that if we observe racism and take it seriously, then one of the elements that we need to grapple with is that which forces are actually the ones leading the fight, are energetic, offer some sort of solution that goes beyond this notion of cooperation. And these political powers, they come from different political formations, but the most energetic have been since the 80s, the late 80s specifically, have been political formations that arose from Islamist political space in Palestine, including the Islamic Jihad and Hamas, and others like Kataib al-Mujahideen or Alwiyat Nasser Salahuddin, that have that kind of Islamist tendency. Alongside, of course, remnants of the revolutionary left that are still active and engaged. And I don't want to belittle that, but the major force now, the energetic force, are those. And I don't think, as a fact, we cannot turn away from that and simply just dismiss it. So to me, that is what's central. I mean, if you're standing in solidarity and you have Abu Mazen on the other side of the equation, then you're basically standing in solidarity with also an authoritarian regime that wants to suppress the Palestinians, that disables our ability to accumulate power or create the conditions to resist, or even to to defend ourselves against this, encroaching assault by the settlers and the Israeli military, for instance, in the West Bank. I mean, there's a level on which our political orientation and alliance has to take at least this kind of dividing line into account as we make or as we espouse these positions. So that's what I intended with that piece, is to give people a sense of Palestinian politics, some of its history a bit, and to try and grapple with that, and also for them to think through these things, specifically at a moment where a lot of people are claiming we should dismiss, overlook. It's as if they don't exist, these political formations, or we just stick to, I don't know, some sort of, phantasmic solidarity with Palestine as a notion and as a concept, without, giving it, a body that walks and talks and has, some sort of physical material presence. That's an element to it. That I think the other part is that it's for me, important since at least 10 years to try and get, some of the Palestinian intellectuals, some of the Palestinian academics, but also a lot in the world. We should not be afraid of Israeli propaganda. We should not be afraid of, this idea that they throw at us like Hamas and they try to scare us with, because they think this is the way through which we will be, in a defensive posture. There has to be a recognition. I mean, we should be able to speak our own politics and the way we view the world. And even if there's criticisms and critiques and other elements that we want to disentangle, it has to be nuanced, and shouldn't emanate from a politics of fear. It shouldn't be emanate from a politics of I'm too afraid to make an intervention around Hamas as a political formation, or why at this particular moment the left should perhaps think through its position on Hamas and come with a nuanced articulation of that. I think that that's something that we have, as Palestinians historically, they try to like sometimes, I don't know, please a lot of the Western media and a lot of the Western, mainstream intellectuals, and in many ways that kind of symbolic concessions that we have made throughout the years, especially when we're speaking English, have not benefited us, because every time, the Zionists come up with lines that try to make us profane, diabolical, crazy, that blame us for our own occupation and disposition, and we continue to fall victims for that game. I mean, on a propaganda and even on a level of political engagement, that shouldn't be the concentration through which we create that. And that means that as well, on some level, even if you're completely agnostic to Hamas politically internally, that there's some level of it, of your political participation in discussions in English in the world, that has to defend it. You can't be. I think I'm reminded here by Bass's al-Araj words. Which he said, if you're like very radical with your own people and very pragmatic with your enemies, I mean, you create the situation for fissures within your society. Like you create the situation for this form of Sikhism that we see between, a demobilized PA that sees actually in Hamas the enemy, but looks at Israel as some sort of ally that it can bring to the table to fight Hamas. So, at some point you reach, you can turn from this kind of radical internal antagonism towards a political formation to using colonial powers and imperial powers, or intellectual centers for your own game of trying to defeat your internal foe. And I think this is a cardinal mistake in politics, specifically in anti-colonial politics, and should not be engaged on. And I think it's a dangerous game. It's one that the PA and the PLO bourgeois elite led by Abu Mazen has engaged in since 2006. It's disastrous. It's leading to also, in this current conjuncture, to the fact that Gaza is paying a heavy price nearly alone, without the participation of other parts of the Palestinian society, and leading to also somewhat to the fragmentation of the Palestinian people, without true engagement and participation and solidarity, or whatever we want to call it. And I don't think it's solidarity, but true engagement in this whole struggle. So for me, that is also a cardinal mistake that needs to be addressed. I mean, again, you can't be radical with your own society and pragmatic with your enemy. It has to be the other way around. Pragmatic with your own society, with your own internal, political formations to some degree, but you have to be radical with those that either serve the enemy or are the enemy.
Appreciate all of that. I mean, and one thing for me too, from leftist traditions, and I know not everybody here will be of tradition that would agree with this or see this as, a line that they would want to adopt, but I think about Lenin in regards to this to some degree too, and just sort of think about the CPUSA and the Black Belt thesis, the idea, think about the general line of solidarity with anti-colonial resistance, right? And the idea being that, we as communists in this case, as people on the left, support these movements. And sure, to the extent that we have parties that are engaged or involved, we support those and we hope that they win out, right? However, the basics of the politics of self-determination is also that we don't get to make that choice ultimately, right? And so I think a basic question that people on the Western left should ask, right, is what do Palestinians, broadly speaking, think about resistance, right? And I know that there's various positions on this, right? But if you just look at polls, you know, there's popular support for resistance, right? More so even than Hamas as a political party. There's support for Qassam, right? And for the other resistance factions. And I think that speaks to an expression of self-determination, right? And if the overwhelming majority of Palestinians were against resistance, right? Were polled and said, "We hate this. This is stupid. These people are bad," etc. Then we should take a harder look in the mirror, right, about whether or not this is something that we want to support. But I think that um, that's one way that I would look at it. And to move it to another question, I mean, you talked about this a little bit in your last response, but I really appreciated the way you laid this out in the piece. So maybe you could rehash it a little bit here. Is you want to trouble this notion also of what's socially progressive and socially regressive within Palestinian society. Um, because and maybe we can wrap into this a little bit, but maybe to connect a couple questions I wanted to ask. It's important to note that there are leftist organizations or parties within Palestine that take various positions, right? And so we could easily pick out any one of them and say, oh, well, that's the position we should support. It's a position of collaboration with the PA, or it's a position that says we don't support Hamas or Fatah or the PA, right? Like we just we're on our own here. Or there's a position which the PFLP takes to says like we're joining the resistance. We're gonna have factions that participate in this, and in that it means working alongside and in solidarity with Hamas and Islamic Jihad, etc. Right, and so like you could look at that as a Westerner and say, well, any one of those, well, okay, I align myself with the DFLP, or I align myself with the former Communist Party, as you kind of lay out in the piece. Um, so maybe talk a little bit about that and about why I mean, I know we've talked about it a lot, but the problem of collaboration, right, as a socially regressive thing rather than thinking about resistance as socially regressive.
I mean, look, it's hard to disentangle your question because it touches upon two histories. First of all, it touches upon one of the least studied histories in Palestinian, even academic knowledge production, which is the history of cooperation and collaboration with Zionists. There's like this dirty laundry that we don't want to touch. It creates a lot of sensitivities socially, especially if you're pointing people's names and their families. And there's a long history of that we just don't want to broach in a significant way. And that means that we have very little conceptual tools to look at all the projects before the Nakba and after the Nakba that have attempted some sort of either accommodation and collaboration or cooperation with Zionism. And they span various motivations. They're ideological in some sense. They're sectarian. Sometimes they're material. Sometimes it's this kind of like policy of I'm going to use Israel against my internal foe. whether within a small community like a village or within a larger community, or it has like this kind of material economic type of collaboration. And there's various typologies, various projects that span also different elements. But since Oslo, at least, we had a faction from the PLO that saw that its own political survival as an almost dead, non-energetic political revolutionary organization exiled in Tunisia was to basically strike a deal with the colonial power and entrench itself and fixate itself in the occupied territories, manage Palestinian life on the premise and hope that there's a negotiated two-state outcome that never really transpired. And that was a moment that was also highly problematic for the Palestinian left, because it fractured into these small little factions, in terms of being emptied out from its mobilization strategies, from recruits, from the ability to grow within society. And it confined itself to being a pliant opposition to the PA, to this nascent PA. And much of the left was NGOized. It went to the NGO system, to the civil society. And they, like the Palestinian Authority, it was an NGOization process that also involved a lot of foreign funding coming from Europe and the US and from the alliance system that sustains, the arrangement in our region that spans these kind of regressive countries in the Gulf and Israel and the US. And at the same time, they were playing like second fiddler to the PA and its project and to the state building, notion. And for a long time, that was the position until they've lost all political power of mobilization, or not all, but most political power of mobilization. The remnants of that left, are either too weak to really challenge the PLO in the West Bank, or actually are in cahoots with the Palestinian leadership, or are in opposition, and therefore they're outside of that configuration altogether, that the PLO itself. The PFLP in the past couple of years has taken that position to remove itself from the PLO as it's transformed into this kind of unashamed, quite openly collaborative political system that we see have risen in the West Bank. But that was only in the past couple of years that they kind of severed much of their ties, at least official ties, with the PLO. And they have this position of, okay, Hamas at least has this resistant project, and they've built it for the past 20 years. They've been the energetic force on the scene, the young force that, rose in the 80s. When the old, refused to die. And they're now leading this military formation, organization, this, ability to generate, weapons and design them and create this architecture of subterranean architecture that enables this capacity to resist, to go over time. And because they share that, at least this anti-colonial stance with the Islamists, they have shared also to some degree, a good close relationship with Hamas and the Islamic Jihad specifically. I mean, of course, Islamic Jihad is a different kind of political formation, because it's one that is purely devoted to resistance in many ways throughout its history. It does not want to engage in the politics of governance. It has little. It doesn't have a hegemonic program within Palestinian society, so it does not want to transform the Palestinian subject from some sort of fictitious, regressive subject to some sort of Islamist or progressive or whatever. It doesn't have that social agenda at the heart of its political project. It sees resistance itself as the agenda, and therefore its answer to every predicament the Palestinians face is to resist and resist more. So whenever you're caught, whenever you're, whether it's, a moment of great hope or a moment of great helplessness, the Islamic Jihad's answer is resist. That's That's the Islamic Jihad. Hamas is a combination of a social political movement, a social and political and armed movement. So they have, and they were built largely as a social political movement in the beginning. Although it's not true that they only, the Islamic Brotherhood only started to fight against Israel after the second Intifada or the first Intifada. I'm sorry. I mean, there's a longer history of Islamic Brotherhood and Muslim Brotherhood engaging in resistance going back to the 30s and throughout. But for the first time, Hamas, as an Islamic resistance group, announces itself after the initial year of the first Intifada, and then becomes this political formation that develops this armed movement that we're seeing today. So you have Hamas, which binded and has this program of also transforming the political subject, the Palestinian becoming this, devout person who's also faithful to our own authentic culture, which in Hamas's mind is tied to Islam, and the power that Islam also has to transform our societies to a more or a better society. So there's like this social and political, and at the same time anti-colonial agenda that Hamas adopted. So just to be clear, the left was completely emptied out from its ability to mobilize in many ways. And that meant that the ones that are really leading the struggle, at least in terms of numbers, in terms of presence, in terms of seriousness, in terms of, being on the forefront, have been, the Islamic Jihad and Hamas mostly, at least after the second Intifada. And in this sense, we can't just look beyond that fact. Like we can't just go beyond it. Now there are different leftist positions here, and different progressive positions that people can take. And again, I mentioned that in the beginning, like this whole socially regressive and progressive. I mean, if we look at a political formation like the PA, that actually, has to create a lot of divisions within society to sustain its rule, then it's a highly regressive political power. I mean, beyond the idea that some leftists in Ramallah have that, okay, Ramallah has some, I don't know, couple of bars and people can go and drink alcohol and do things that are on a personal level has a connection to their own personal lifestyles. It hides the fact that in many ways the authority is very pragmatic. It builds alliance with different social and traditional formations wherever it's there. It doesn't hurt the interests of some of these formations like clans or families or sects or different cultural groups that have different interests and have personal styles issue or have some particular social agenda like the arts and culture. And then it can sometimes use these different groups and pit them against each other to say that we're the only ones capable of protecting you from each other. Like that's one of the elements of how the PA has been able to sustain itself as well, is not through only the fear and we talked about the ideological component of it, of people seeing Abu Mazen a figure of hate, project onto him this idea that he's a somebody who cooperates with Israel, but at the same time at some level deep down there is this also fear of Israel that enables Abu Mazen to continue. So we can hate, he's an object that we can hate, but without necessarily willing or able to overthrow or create a political moment to disentangle him, because at least at some level we think maybe he'll protect us from this military machine that is willing to kill people in mass, etc. So there is that element to that, but there's also another element, and in the past couple of years, it's been highly expanding in a sense of I don't know, like if some Palestinians have a progressive agenda tied to, for example, LGBTQ community, and then it would use that agenda to remind the traditional society, look, these people are coming to, infiltrate the social, ethical, virtuous system, and they're trying to implant these foreign social, identity issues onto the society, and we're the ones standing, for instance, up for them by arresting or doing this form of morality policing that has also been happening, or we had a couple of incidents like that in the past couple of years, and for instance, places like Ramallah and other places. Or if you have, antagonisms relating to cultural productions, or some of the novels being written. So cultural issues can be used to divide society and then create cultural and identity struggles within Palestinian society, through which the Palestinian Authority comes in and says, I am your only savior. And we had this issue with the DJ, a couple of years ago. The same thing, Sama Abdul who did this some sort of DJ near Nabi Musa, and the PA would play this role again, of trying to calm the traditional society, and at the same time telling the more liberal lifestyle people that also exist in the West Bank that I'm the only one that saves you from these regressive forces, and telling the regressive forces I'm the only one protecting you from the immoral encroachment of Western values and stuff like that. So what I was trying to, at least, I don't know if I took a long time to do that, but what I was trying to just show that first of all, by demobilizing people and reducing their capacity to resist, and also killing that capacity in many ways through torture and through the prison system that exists in the Palestinian Authority, you're not allowing the Palestinian to exercise any form of agency that can exhilarate him or transform him from a subject that is, being subjugated to this forms of violence and control imposed by Israel. You're just finding this indirect form of control that fuels the inferiority complex in Palestinians, that fuels cultural and social regression, that fuels people going back to narrow identities to protect themselves against the world. So I see in many ways that the PA, whether on a psychological level, whether on the level of, is a much more regressive force than, for instance, any political party that practices forms of resistance against a colonial power. Because at least within the potentialities of that, practice, there exists, some sort of, an exercise of agency. People's imagination can be open, people's consciousness can be, expanded. There is an element to resistance that, empowers people who feel completely paralyzed politically and incapable of facing the challenges. And therefore, there is that element that, has the potential to liberate people, and actually to liberate them also from, being caught in this machine that humiliates, that, makes you feel inferior. And therefore, it has that, capacity to as well widen the imagination even beyond the political ideology of what the anti-colonial resistance adopts. So if it's Islamist, it doesn't mean that people get stuck simply on an Islamist agenda, because I think the potentiality of resistance, no matter who's forming it and empowering it, has also a potential to liberate, beyond the specific ideological agenda. The other part, Jared, which I think is important, is that if you want to challenge Islamists, that you need to, and I write that in the piece. Basically, you need to outdo them in what they do. I mean, it's not about it's fine if you want to challenge them, but we don't challenge them by breaking down or by trying to say that your resistance is futile, because then there's a problem. Because then your problem is not with Hamas. Your problem is a position against resistance as such. And if your problem is with resistance as such, whether it's armed or non-armed, then you should just say it clearly, because then you're just, it's just disingenuous, and I don't think it's courageous. Just, make a position that is clear I'm against armed resistance 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Fine, it's not the first person that have said that, and it's not going to be the last person have said that. But just say it. But don't hide your antagonism towards armed resistance or towards any form of resistance through this hypening up and exaggeration of Islamist ideology. Because if we have a problem with Hamas on a social and ideological level, then the issue which I raised, which is the idea of muzawada, or one surpassing your internal foe, has to be your own view of how you look at this. And that means doing it better, doing it, mobilizing it in a different way, providing the impetus for better tactics, creating the ability to mobilize people and organize them. That's what you need to be involved in, not in an intellectual attack or intellectual attacks against resistance as such.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That was one of the questions I was going to ask you about. Was the idea of one-upmanship through action, which you just mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, it has a history, Jared. So, I mean, that's one thing that people, whenever anybody looks at the Second Intifada, most people who have observed it have said this was a moment where the Palestinians were not united. So they didn't have a unified leadership. Unlike the first Intifada, where there was a unified leadership that people adhered to the politics of summoning, people were always pointing out that actually Palestinian factions were disunited and were engaged in this kind of politics of outdoing each other, and they didn't have one single political agenda. And that's one of the reasons that they give for the failure of the Second Intifada. And they have a point there. I'm not trying to challenge that in many ways, that there is a level on which that is correct. But I think also it's important that forms of disunity are always different. And in the Second Intifada, there was no unity over a political program, because you had people like the Hamas and Islamic Jihad insisting on the idea of liberation, PFLP as well, insisting on the idea of liberation, which is also a signifier that has means different things, perhaps. Maybe for Hamas it means an Islamic state, maybe for PFLP means one democratic secular state. You have different notions of what liberation would mean eventually. But I think that despite that disunity in terms of leadership, and despite this transformation of leadership from the united leadership in the first Intifada, from this kind of more cohesive political and program between the different factions, towards some sort of coordination. But what is important is that there was still unity in the direction of action. Fatah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, PFLP, they competed with each other. They had an intra-war going on, trying to compete with each other in terms of the quantity of actions they're doing, in terms of the quality of the actions, and even the spectacle of the action, political action. But that kind of disunity on the level of political program did not transfer into disunity on a politics of resistance. And the direction of their actions were very clear. It wasn't internal, at least at that point. It was directed at the Israeli occupation and its persistence, whether in Gaza or the West Bank. And that's what didn't happen in this moment. In this moment, you have Hamas and Islamic Jihad and the Palestinian factions like the DFLP and the PFLP and other factions in Gaza, fighting. And at the same time, you have complete politics of demobilization and even the assassination of Palestinian fighters in the West Bank by the PA, and an unwillingness to also, in any way or form or shape, to permit some sort of political collective action to take place, whether by the PA itself or by the Palestinian society that is not involved in the security services. Because even if you go on a protest in Ramallah, or do any small action now, there's a big risk of arrest, torture, either by Israel or the PA, just based on minute action that doesn't even threaten the system at all. Like they're mostly symbolic, but they're being met with heavy-handed force. So I think this is important. That the disunity today it's a different form of disunity. It's not like in the Second Intifada. And the muzawade, rhetorical muzawade, this is now taking place on a level of either people for resistance and therefore celebrating its actions, etc., or people who are saying, you see, this is what happens when you resist. And it takes complex forms, of course, and it mingles with a lot of different discourses, and also, I think, psychoaffective, sources that generate, a lot of now the rhetorical fighting that is happening on social media in Palestine. And some of it, of course, is not purely Palestinian. It's like psychic and ideological assaults by, the mass media, the Arab mass media, and the Palestinian media that is faithful to the PA, etc. But at least on that level, that the form of muzawada is different. It's not one through action. It's one through you see what resistance does to us, and I think that's a big issue and a big flaw in our current political moment. That we should look at as well, and analyze and assess and view with these differentiations, also as we make this kind of historical analogy from before. And I was trying to show it in the piece and highlight it to show that means that the polarization in Palestinian politics has also become much more distant in many ways. It's not like the Second Intifada where you can stand in solidarity with Yasser Arafat and have some sort of that. Now the polarization is really one that is taking place on this pole between collaboration with Israel or resistance to it in many ways. And at the heart, they both are survival strategies at their core.
Appreciate that. I'm going to ask a two-part question that's going to pull in some audience question too. So, AG asked if you could speak about how communist resistances are also helping Hamas in fighting of the IDF, Zionists. I'm assuming that's PFLP and DFLP or DLP, Democratic DFLP factions in Gaza. The other thing too is interesting. So there's a person that never is here for a live, but they always leave me a comment right after you and I talk. And this person sort of feels like you sometimes diminish the armed movements in the West Bank. And part of this came the last time we spoke, we talked about leadership and a lack of leadership in the West Bank. And I didn't take that as you saying there were no armed movements or no, military kind of leadership, but more of a question of like political, social leadership for other forms of, resistance and protests and things like that. But I wanted to give you a chance to kind of clarify that and then maybe say a little bit about the left factions that do support Hamas.
Yeah, look, I don't. I'm not sure what this person said or didn't say. I don't diminish anything as much as possible, but I also don't like to give people a lot of illusions about things. So I'm not one of I don't. The West Bank right now, there is an active armed movement. I was one of the first to actually write a lot of articles about it in Arabic, and this movement is based on the rise of a new generation. It has elements of relationship with the wider resistance movements in the region that back it up financially, and I think with resources, including perhaps training and smuggling of weapons, etc. and as well as it was built on this kind of conception in the beginning of like friendship groups and intimate relationships that turn into like into a more organized armed movement, and that took the self-defense posture through urban dense spaces in the north of the West Bank. So this is to just describe it just largely. Generally speaking, we've had always like a fissure in Palestinian society between a highly revolutionary praxis coming from working class Palestinians, from various social, let's say, spaces that are just more radical by their very existence, like for instance camps, and a dissonance with generally traditional elites, and whether they're clerical, whether they're economic, or whether they're political, that were always more pragmatic and viewed always the praxis of either the Palestinian peasants before 48 or the Palestinians from refugee camps that became, for instance, the bedrock of the PLO and its revolutionary subjectivity, as something to either contain or use as some sort of bargaining chip with the colonial powers. No. Now, one of the issues that I was trying to just hint at in the West Bank now is that we have in semi-organized armed movement, and it's taking different shapes and forms, but it's mostly trying to defend its own space through IEDs and clashes and preventing this kind of power of arrest from happening easily. And it did not really necessarily do a lot of offensive actions against Israelis, although they do shoot at checkpoints and settlements, etc. But I mean, there was very few like offensive operations, whether sophisticated or not, that happened. There is, but not but the major concentration for these armed movements was this kind of self-defense posture. And what I was trying to point out is that there is no social movement from the middle class that is meeting this armed movement. So that the armed movement is opening up a political space, but the problem is that there's no middle class coming and meeting it halfway to create the basis of an alliance, a class alliance, if you want, or any other alliance that could actually replace the current modus operandi of politics in the West Bank. So that's the only thing that I was trying to point out. If that was not clear, then that's what I was trying to say. And that part of the question that we can talk about is the question of leadership. And again, leadership can be roles, it can be things that people do within a movement. It could have different forms. In Palestinian revolution tradition is also heavily, I think this is one point that I should emphasize, that Palestinians are very cynical towards leaders generally now. And they've been bidden, they've been betrayed, they've been highly and systematically have a problem of distrust with a lot of with anybody who claims to be a leader, or anybody who wants to be a leader, or anybody trying to place himself as a leader. So there is that. It comes from a history of trauma. It comes from Oslo and the symbolic concessions there. It comes from, seeing people going to prison their lives and dying for the cause, and seeing others, benefiting from, collaboration with Israel, even though they were once also, I don't know, maybe revolutionaries or activists in at some point in their lives. So they're seeing that kind of like cynical interests interplay with, and they have deep distrust with leaders, and they don't have that kind of deep connection, emotional connection, that perhaps at specific times they had more with people like George Habash or Yasser Arafat or other people in the history of the Palestinian revolutionary tradition. So, but there's also kind of like a leadership that leads. And what I mean by that is that you provide some sort of figure of emulation, and you lead the people not by being a power over them, but by, kind of being the first on the road of opening the space for resistance. And in that sense, I think the armed movement in the north of the West Bank is leading, is in many ways opening that space through these figures of sacrifice as well, through these young people who are holding arms and fighting Israel and trying to sustain themselves through time. And that is, that idea of in Arabic we say qudwa wa laysa qa'id. Yani we say that he's somebody that leads you to, and is not a leader on you. Like that kind of distinction is important. Is that type of leadership? I don't know if that was understood, but if it's not, I can try to articulate it better in English. But that type of leadership exists. However, I think that what is central is that also when you're talking about social movements, when you're talking about larger middle class coming into the fold, breaking the ideological hegemony of the PA, trying to refigure society and organize it, that there needs figures that are trusted by society. It needs people who can explain the world, and at the same time it needs political formation that can replace the current elites and their own politics. Now, maybe people would disagree on that, but that's I think an important component, at least to me. There might be a discussion here or a debate, and that's what I see missing. I see missing this kind of middle class social movement, or a middle class social movement that can be an alliance to this kind of armed movement that is happening in the north of the West Bank. The other thing is important is that it's only in the north, to a large extent, that this movement hasn't really spread to the rest of the West Bank. And that's an important point that a lot of people miss. It's basically between the Jordan Valley and the north of the West Bank. So Nablus, Jenin, Tulkarem, and not all of Nablus, but and some of the villages that are in these areas. So in many ways, we can't speak of a real intifada in the West Bank in the sense of at least the intifadas we recall in the past, even on the level of the second intifada. This is confined to a specific geography within the West Bank, which tells you also about the modalities of control in the West Bank that separates and dissects societies, and that have different political and social formations even within this kind of condensed geography. From the north to the center of the West Bank, moving to the southern West Bank area, which includes Bethlehem and Hebron. So, it also tells you that even within the West Bank itself, that geographic divisions, the nature of life and its rhythm, and the type of social formations within it is also quite radically different in different areas, and haven't been really studied well, to try to explain why, for instance, now we have this kind of revolt happening in one part of the West Bank, but not in other parts of the West Bank in the same extent. Now, it doesn't mean that there's no resistance in other parts, but it's not taking this kind of semi-organized armed formation that we have seen in the north. Some people attribute it to differences in tactics. Some areas have traditionally liked a more clandestine form of organizations, while in the north of the West Bank, maybe people relish this form of like more public and self-defense formations, specifically as the memory of the Second Intifada plays a role also in the regeneration of these movements. But I've talked a lot. I don't want to go into it more, but that's what I meant by the whole leadership thing. As for, I think there was a second part to your question, if I recall.
Yeah, it was just about like the PFLP and the DFLP in Gaza. Like, what do you see as their contributions, or how do you kind of analyze them within the broader scope of resistance?
The thing about, again, Gaza, if we recall in our conversation, is that after the second Intifada, Gaza, the Israelis removed the settlements and withdrew and besieged Gaza from from outside. And what that means is that all the resistant groups within Gaza, um, and specifically after Hamas's takeover, had uh, a lot of freedom to organize their own armed movements and, training and recruitment, etc. Of course, there's a politics there as well. There's a lot of politics there, and give and take between the different armed factions and the extent of cooperation. Also like political formations and military formations like Hamas, giving some space but not necessarily all the space. There's an intricate and nuanced politics that you need to write its own history in its own right. But the leftist political formations in Gaza, had the chance or the ability to continue, expanding and building the resources and attempting to build their own military formation. So they're folded within this larger resistance, but of course they have their own distinct identity, and they use primarily similar tactics like the rest of the resistance in Gaza. I don't think there's very, very, very big differences between them, but in some instances, the fact that there's different factions give freedom to resistance of Gaza to do things that other political parties wouldn't do. Like, I'll give just an example, like hitting the pier, the American pier that was used in the recent, operation to extract the captives, the Israeli captives. So, for instance, the left, because it first of all, it's ideologically, antagonistic towards imperialism and sees America as in the tradition of the left, the head of the snake, and therefore they're not hesitant about, for example, targeting the pier or throwing, some form of hound or other forms of firepower on it. But to some degree, like Hamas might be more reluctant because there's an intricate relationship now going in terms of negotiating a ceasefire, and America's involved, and to what extent do you want to get the Americans angry or not, and the calculation behind that. So having these smaller, more liberated groups from these kind of political considerations has its kind of utility also to larger armed movement. Historically speaking, the PFLP were more invested, generally speaking, in spectacular forms of attacks. A lot of people will challenge me on that, but I think the PFLP was generally a very Leninist organization. It usually had a high, the people that would join the military side of things would be, highly filtered from a lot of different, from the social base. And because they were a small organization, they invested in forms of operation that would grab attention and at the same time have this kind of multiplier effect. With Wadi'a Haddad, it was the kidnapping of the planes in the 70s, and this kind of motto of follow the enemy everywhere, or hunt the enemy everywhere. Wadi'a Haddad was a Palestinian from Lid, and he was one of the founding, let's say, fathers of the PFLP, and a friend of George Habash, but they had a dispute at some point. But the other things was like in the second Intifada, they organized the assassination of Minister of Agriculture, who was also one of the outright fascists in the government, Rahbam Zaevi. So not necessarily a lot of quantitative forms of attack, but they always go for these type of attacks that are complex, sophisticated, and can grab attention and be a force multiplier for their presence in the Palestinian political field. Or they also operate more freely than other politically more constrained political groups, like Hamas, or in the past also Fatah, in terms of the nature or type of operations and their political implications more broadly. So that is part of the role. I think that there's a long discussion about the left in Palestine that one people can go to and get to know more. But the PFLP and DFLP are present in terms of an armed movement in Gaza, and they are folded within the larger political movement. Although the DFLP is more friendly to the PLO and Fatah than the PFLP at this particular moment in the history of both political parties. Well, not only this one, just generally. I mean, but I don't want to.
I mean, it's probably worthy of its own. I mean, I know there's discussions elsewhere that people can seek out, but maybe at some point we should do a longer, kind of history of the left. There's some of it that we covered also in the episode on insurgency and counterinsurgency in the West Bank, and thinking about, as you talked about a little bit earlier in this conversation, absorption into NGOs and all of these other things in that geography. So continuing on, there's other things I want to get to, but I do want to move to this past weekend. So, Saturday, which is when I wrote these questions, there was a brutal massacre. Now the number is at least 270 Palestinians, according to the health authority. And the wounded is probably 600 plus. I haven't seen recent number on that, but and this is being lauded. I mean, even today I was watching the stupid mainstream news, and this is being lauded as a great success by the United States and the corporate media. It obviously did. They were able to recapture 4 hostages. I believe they've all now been confirmed to have been military, so real prisoners of war, right? And also, I think there were 3 other, according to Hamas, at least, there were 3 other captives that the IDF killed, or the IOF killed in this operation. And I mean, there's debates about how much U.S. is involved. Some people have claimed that they were on the ground, or there's certainly the proximity of the pier to the helicopter. People have seen those images, but there's been admissions in corporate news that at very least the U.S. was collaborating in terms of providing intelligence, and so was British intelligence, and that they've been doing that since the beginning. And so I don't know what all of that will mean for folks. I mean, I would hope that for anyone who has any lack of clarity at this point, although I don't know who that would be, that it makes it quite clear the US's involvement, directly in this kind of genocide. But also, as you watch this media, it's quite clear that they're laundering it. I mean, there's no question raised by the US media about whether an operation in which 270 Palestinians are killed is worth extracting 3 hostages, when there could be a negotiation that would preserve the life of everybody involved. And so I hope that for folks it helps people understand quite clearly again the direct role of the US, the British, of Germany, with their obscene level of support for the Zionist entity. But talk about the operation in general and kind of how you think it's sitting. I mean, I think another thing we could throw in there too, to make it more complicated for you, is that yesterday Benny Gantz resigned, right? And so there's also some things happening at a level of the kind of ruling coalition within Israel right now, and maybe somewhat around strategy, right? Not around, or tactics, not around obviously the genocidal impulse of Israel towards Palestinians. But yeah, I mean, I guess what are you thinking about right now around these things?
I mean, look, yesterday was a bad day, of course, a horrible day in many ways, because it was both a continuation of the daily massacres in Gaza and the killing and the pain of people who are suffering a catastrophic war that has killed, Gaza, at least in terms of a built environment, but has also been, again, very brutal in its consequences on the people. And it's, taking a long time, and we should start from there, because I think a large part of that operation was also, into the massacre was integral to it. It wasn't just an excess of it. So it was, for me, and I think it's important that people recognize that the killing of 270 people was not just an accident. It was meant to both shock Palestinians by committing that massacre, which is a primary means in this war for people to capitulate and surrender and force the resistance to surrender. And at the same time to do this form of extraction operation of these four Israeli captives, which is a tactical victory in the level of being able to reach there and like infiltrate and extract them and take them back without a negotiating process. So there's that. There's this duality that interplayed together. Both kind of on the level of psychological warfare, a tactical victory, but that, for me, Israel also over emphasized. Like there's a level of mythologization of that extraction operation. And to me, I think that tells us a lot about how not much good news Israel's been receiving in the past 8 months on the level of its military and its power and the way it exercises its power. And it harkens back to, I think, another, and I'm writing a piece about this, this whole notion of shock without awe. And I think that I'm writing now this long piece on it. I don't know if it's gonna like make it into the world, but we'll see, because I've been suffering with it. But anyways, there's a level to it that this this yearning among Israelis for their power to induce spectacular moments on military terms. What I mean by that is, like, part and parcel of the Zionist project was not only the use of military power or the massacres or the horror, or it was also for Israelis, for instance, if we go back to 1967 and defeating Arab armies in 6 days. It was actually 5 days, but defeating all these Arab armies in 6 days and tripling the size of Israel in this kind of spectacular moment of victory that vindicated kind of the right to Palestine, and played or interplayed a lot in the formation of Israeli subjectivity and also its notion of how to use power on an aesthetic level. So that there's a level to that in this operation, which is something they yearn for. It's this moment of using their military power in creative, agile, precise, necessarily intelligent means that has been part and parcel of how Israelis see themselves in terms of what it means to be a soldier or a commander or a creative commander, what it means to be a colonial outpost that not only has bombs and drops them, but also has some sort of creative means and techniques to use that power and can impress the world and leave you in awe and leave you in surrendering just by that ability to use this agile form of power. And since the beginning of this war, on that front, on just that front, the Palestinian resistance was able and capable more of creating these moments than Israel, even though Israel is capable of killing in mass, and I don't want to underestimate that at all. And the pain in Gaza is felt, and it's a heavy moment for every Palestinian out there. The extent of dehumanization and mass killing, but there's nothing really that creative in their use of power. I mean, it's almost like an imbecile just pushed a button, let a machine, work, and it has very little ability to actually, even among Israeli society, to induce these moments of, sublime use of power. And that's why I think Israel yesterday was relishing, because not only was it able to still inflict a massacre that kills hundreds of Palestinians, 200, I think, and 76, if I'm wrong, not wrong, and at the same time, attack people in another, safe zone, or supposedly a safe zone, violating yet again, I think, the law of sanctuary that it has been doing since the beginning of this war, delineating hospital and then going and destroying that hospital. Israel has been, this kind of obscene military power that tells us what it's going to do before it does and then does it, to induce this form of shock of its ability to both transgress all forms of laws and to relish in it. Something like the obscenity of Trump in terms of his rhetoric, but just more dangerous and genocidal. And at the same time, it has this, moment that harkens back into these sublime moments of, daring operations, creative, the Entebbe, when they went and extracted from the PFLP and the Better Meinhof organization. The brother of Prime Minister Netanyahu was killed in that. Netanyahu was killed in that operation. But in that operation, for instance, only the Palestinian and their comrades were killed, and I think 2 or 3 civilians that were also involved. But largely was not a highly deadly form of attack. But in this case, you see these two powers interplay: the power of the massacre and also that kind of like extraction that is involved. I mean, as for American involvement or lack of involvement, I'm not sure. I don't know how to read that. I mean, I don't know how to read the leaks of that. It seems quite problematic that Americans use the pier that they pretended is for humanitarian purposes. There's also this level of using humanitarian aid trucks to infiltrate that is supposedly out there, but I'm not sure of that information. I don't want to make like statements that are not factually grounded, but there is there's an accusation that also the special forces unit that infiltrated used humanitarian trucks to infiltrate, and that type of maneuver within using the pier, which is supposedly for humanitarian purposes, for a military purpose, creates kind of a tenuous problem in terms of the relationship between the Palestinian resistance and also this pier, and also the American soldiers that perhaps are safeguarding this pier and working on it or through it. And then there was supposedly some rumors about American even Delta forces coming in, but I'm not sure that's correct. Probably the days will tell if that's true, or intelligence. But if it's true that whatever level of involvement the Americans had, and specifically if it was intelligence and direct participation in the operation, it says something either to the fact that that Israel needs that much support and help and is vulnerable in a way that we haven't really understood before, because it seems to me quite eerie that would take place, because Israel is a country that always insists on its independent power, this whole idea of being an autonomous, capable of making its own decision, not necessarily in need of a lot of foreign support and influence. And even when it comes to its own backyard, like Gaza, needing intelligence from American intelligence, or getting logistical or actual direct support from military operations from the U.S. Army, then I think it tells us something about the fragility of Israel at this moment, and to the extent that it needs that kind of support. But again, I mean, that information needs to be, corroborated, and we can't make a real analysis based on just, a hodgepodge of very different rumors, etc. But I think for me, it's important to just emphasize that element, that there's that brutalist use of power that was not needed yesterday for a special operation that you want to extract from Gaza for prisoners. You didn't need to kill that many people. Yet, Israel chose to conduct that massacre. It was part of the design of it. The design was to shock the Palestinians on two levels, both a mass casualty event that they've created, which harkens to this kind of catastrophic mass loss that weakens people's resolve and will to resist, and at the same time a maneuver through surprise and through precise intelligence and disguise deep within Gaza to extract these 4 Israelis. I mean, and in Israeli media was interesting, Jared, that is they only emphasize the extraction, not not the massacre. And of course, not that necessarily Israeli society would be against the massacre, but the Israeli society has been shielded from any real treatment of the consequences of their own brutal genocidal war on Gaza and what it means for the people of Gaza. And at the same time, it's been hyped up by Israeli politicians, this operation, to the extent that I think also it kind of reflects weakness on their side, that I think they feel there hasn't been good news for a long time. They haven't been able to impress the world. They haven't been able to win propaganda, in the propaganda realm. They have been becoming more isolated. Their use of force is not necessarily leading to any strategic outcomes. It's only leading to a lot of people being killed and a lot of homes destroyed, a lot of dreams being, extinguished without, any kind of political consequences for anything. And at the same time, I think they've lost that, I don't know how you call it, but they lost in war-making abilities. They lost that ability to impress and awe their own people, and also impress the distant observer. A large part of even the Jewish diaspora that became Zionist because they were just enamored in this kind of scenes of Israelis being able to defeat 6 Arab armies, or doing these daring operations in distant land, and coming out, triumphant, although facing the abyss. And I think that type of narrative, Israel has just been not able to do it. They can only relish really in a genocidal war, a war where they can do mass casualty and killing and destruction. And they can't really create that. And that's why I think they hyped this extraction to the extent that they could hype it and use it as a political device. But at the end, it didn't really help in terms of maintaining the government. As you said, Gantz resigned, and of course it's a political maneuver to kind of isolate Netanyahu, specifically as he's entering these kind of difficult decisions around the war in Lebanon. And it also has this element of anxiety inducing for a lot of the families of the Israelis captive in Gaza, because on the one hand, it's apparent that these captives were living in people's apartments, it seems, and they were having good food, it seems. They're, just looking at their photos, I'm not trying to make a scientific assessment of their, what really was there, but it seems at least that their conditions of arrest were not horrific, and at least those, 4 that were extracted.
And, the comparison photos that come out of those captives compared to what Palestinians are looking like when they're coming out of captivity right now. Several folks have been making those comparisons online, but they are quite stark in terms of, Palestinians look like they've been starved and tortured, and the Israeli captives who've been held in Gaza, look healthy, right? Like we could just put it in those terms.
Yeah, yeah, but also it seems like they're not, in tunnels, or like they're. It seems like they've been like, on some level, living under captivity, but with conditions that are not. And I think that after that type of operation, it risks the other captives and their conditions. What would the resistance movement now do in terms of like trying to add extra protection layers, or etc. All of these different elements that can go to it. So I think that it also has a level of in anxiety inducing for the families of the rest of the Israelis captive in Gaza, because also these operations are risky. They could always go sideways, and if you're going to insist on that type of extraction of your prisoners without negotiating, it could easily lead to their death, etc. So on some level, it would not lead to the dwindling of the protests when it's involved to the the Israelis pushing for a ceasefire agreement because of the need to exchange prisoners. It will actually induce larger and fierce protests, despite the success. On the level of extracting these protesters. Oh, I'm sorry, not protesters. These prisoners. So that's my take. That I don't think it changes anything on a strategic level. I don't think it changes anything in terms of the agreement that will come up. I don't think it changes anything in terms of. But it was a psychological blow on these two fronts together. And what is very telling for me is that need to still kill 270 people as part of the design of the operation. That proves once again that this is a genocidal war, and it's not about the prisoners. It's about defeating the Palestinian people and rendering them either ethnically cleansed or completely transformed by this world war in a way that they would never dare resist again.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So one of the things that you mentioned that I do want to talk about a little bit more is Hezbollah, is the discussion you brought up of a decision around whether to go to war with Lebanon. And we hear some of this, but I'm curious, like, kind of what your analysis of that situation is. Obviously, we've talked about it at various stages, but it does seem like Hezbollah has been continuously, going up its ladder of escalation, right? Increasing um, the types of actions that it's taking along the border, moving a little bit further down, being a little bit more destructive of infrastructure, buildings, certainly military targets. Um, so, what is your sense on that? And obviously, that's impact on kind of the Israeli ruling society and the kind of their decisions around, what to do with regard to that front, which of course we should say for folks, it has always expressed itself as a front where it's been in solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza, and that, once there's a ceasefire with Gaza, that there will be a cessation of those hostilities from the north, or at least that's what Hezbollah has said to this point. So, yeah, what is your assessment of that currently?
Well, I think, look, we shouldn't underestimate Israel's death drive. And so when we're making the assessment, there are these kind of psychological elements that people should take into account, although they cannot really fully encapsulate whether like a war would unfold and what type of war would unfold, because a war is already happening in with Lebanon. Like it's a limited war with some sort of equations that day to day they change. It's almost like waking up every day with like a new target, a new distance. So there's kind of this rhythm that has been happening, this dance, if you want, between Israel and Hezbollah. Of course, a destructive dance where both are using their tactical agility, their firepower, their various capabilities to inflict harm on the other. And both have had successes, and also failures in on those realm. But Hezbollah in the past 2 months specifically, I mean, starting with May, the accumulation of tactical successes over the past couple of months have been, has made it capable of hitting, defensive, strategic infrastructure, including the Iron Dome. We saw one, documented evidence of them hitting an actual Iron Dome battery, of hitting Israeli soldiers and command centers in multiple areas, and inflicting also harm through these mass forms of fire. And Israel has in the north lost this kind of deterrence that it usually takes as important. And these northern settlements that are frontier settlements as well in many ways, similar to the Gaza envelope, are suffering under the fire of Hezbollah, and who was able to create this kind of buffer zone, but also inside, Palestine 48. And that is a problem. That is a problem in the long term, because I think, very few people would want to live under those conditions from the settler society. You could, even if the war stopped, even if no war stops, happens with Lebanon, there is an element to, of the loss of credibility among, between the settlers in the frontier and the Israeli government and military, that will make it less likely that many people, unless they're very ideologically motivated, will move there. And that also overstretches the ideological group within Israeli society, who now not only has to conquer like frontier areas in the West Bank, but also go to Gaza and go to mixed communities and within Palestine 48, and go to the frontiers area in the north. And that they also have demographic limitations to being able to be everywhere, and that's already problematic for them. Like the people like Smotrich and Bingvir, people who are willing to live in these frontier areas despite the price they might pay for such a life. So there's a loss in that credibility. And for many in the Israeli political elites and military brass, they're looking at this and they're saying that the only way that we can, kind of reclaim some sense of dignity and deterrence is through an expansion of the war in the south of Lebanon, and to inflict more destruction in Lebanon that will exact a price from Hezbollah and its allies in Lebanon, and rebalance this equation of deterrence. And the rhetoric around the war has been expanding, and the Israeli media has been like trying to prepare its own society for a long time for what a war with Hezbollah would mean, especially if it's an open war, because that means it's going to be a different war than the one we've seen thus far, in terms of the destruction that would happen also within Israel itself. So there has been a lot of talk. I can't really predict the future. We can say that in many instances through the past couple of months, Israel has said that it wants to open the war with Lebanon or intensify it, and it has three options here. It can take it a level up and not completely go for an open war, but do this kind of limited area bombardment that ends in a couple of days, but as a signal that it's willing to go for a more open form of warfare. It could go for an open war, but it could also lead to disastrous consequences for a longer term, not only in the immediate term. So I think Israel is in a very what we usually call a strategic dilemma, and a strategic dilemma of what to do, because it has another option, which is to do a ceasefire agreement in Gaza and end the situation in the north without, going into this risky, unpredictable, and uncertain move that could also backfire in their faces. So um, it will be assessing its own options, and I think this is one element that we should all take into account, is that we don't know the extent of Israeli losses in in their military vehicles, in their tanks, in their soldiers injured or soldiers being incapable of fighting because of psychological trauma. There's a lot of information hidden on which we cannot really, nobody can really make a accurate, objective assessment of the real readiness of Israel to fight a war. Because war can also happen on, not only be an aerial bombardment of Lebanon, and not only it be rocket barrages going to Israel, but it could be also involve ground forces, either by Israel invading the southern Lebanese areas, or the other way around, which is also a plausible scenario of Hezbollah also doing some sort of offensive maneuvers within Israeli territory, whether large scale, medium scale, or small scale, and that also has the potential for a disaster for Israel in many ways, that they would not be able to foresee, despite the high cost that also Lebanon will probably pay in such a war. I think Hezbollah doesn't want an open war. I don't think the forces allied with the Palestinian resistance are interested in an open war. They're interested in placing a lot of pressure, in entering the calculus of the Israeli decision maker, in compressing the time of war in the Gaza Strip, in extracting a price from Israel, in reframing equations of deterrence with Israel in the long term. They're not interested in an open war, but I think they have, made the preparation for its possibility. And I think that after 6 months or 8 months now, I think we're in the eighth month almost, or not. That possibility for the Hezbollah and other groups will be high on their agenda and high on their preparation for it. And thus far, their engagement, to be honest, has been one that allows Israel. Their targets are mostly military, and mostly military infrastructure and bases. So they're not giving a lot of room for Israel to have a real excuse for actually a large scale war. Not that Israel wants it, but there's also an element to which a war in Lebanon would only intensify Israel's problems in terms of world opinion, and in terms of its diplomatic and moral standing across the board, and also will weaken its dispersal of forces between Gaza and Lebanon, creating a scenario, I think, that the Israelis will have a hard time managing. And if they didn't have a hard time managing, they would have engaged in such a multi-front war from the beginning. Now it might have needed them some time to prepare, and now they are able of doing that, and that's why they're becoming more confident in speaking. But again, that needs a more concrete analysis of their actual force placement, what they've lost thus far, how much manpower have, what their operational plans are, and to what extent are they willing to fight this fight at this particular juncture in this summer. But I think there's a high possibility of an enlarged operation. The last thing I think that it's important that with either the Palestinian resistance or Lebanese resistance, or all their allies across the region, there's a mix of of strategies here, which includes extracting a price from Israel that transcends the material into the psychic, so that Israel will implode from the inside, not only implode or explode from the outside. And whether it's Palestinian resistance or Hezbollah, they have that kind of dynamic, and that's why they were never really interested, especially Hezbollah, in this kind of direct, all-out, confrontation, but rather in one that draws and tires the enemy. And on some level, although that's coming at a very high price and pain in Palestine, this Israeli insistence on the extension of war only, deepens that, at least within Israeli society. Now, that doesn't mean that the Palestinians, for instance, in Gaza can withstand, the war and its continuation, because it's also, a problem to assume or to fetishize Palestinian in Gaza as people who can, withstand all these assaults and, not have pain and, not want the war to end from the first day. And I always want to, emphasize that, because I think, sometimes people can get drawn by images and spectacle and not understand that there's real pain involved, and that people have a real hope that the war would have ended on October 7th itself. No, so, but there's an extent to this, which is as Israel delays any decisions to end the war or to go for all-out war, that type of vacillation between social accumulation of frustration in Israel, lack of deterrence, its lack of its power to impress, its inability to really solve anything through its military hammer, will add significant problems and will add to the frustration of its own society. And despite its society acceptance of its government's actions and policies at this moment, and I think to the degree that it's possible, Israel, most of Israeli society are just jaded, and they're going along with whatever their government is saying and doing, and a lot of them are also cheering and wanting more. But there's a level to that is dangerous for any settler colonial project. Is that there's a moment where if society loses faith in the army, in its leadership, in its media, in its elites, and those who manage this project, and also adding to that the ideological fissures that exist within Israeli society, that it creates the conditions for intra-fighting and for people voting by their feet and leaving, or people just simply slowly resigning themselves to a life where there's a complete distrust in their state structure and institutions, including the army. And one of the victims or one of the primary successes, if you want, of this war is creating these conditions for the accumulation of frustration and the possibility of larger fissure arising out of this war within Israeli society.
Right on. Thank you for all of that. If you have time, I'm gonna pull one more question from mine, and then I'll see if the audience has some other questions. So I've read the interview that you have in Material, and I definitely encourage people to order a copy of that off the Foreign Language Press website. It's a physical magazine. In that you're addressing sort of some of the things we talked about in the beginning of this conversation, right? Of a sort of left that is antagonistic to resistance. And there's a long history of this in the United States, in the imperial centers around the world, of kind of, to put it very simply, sort of two positions. Obviously, it's much more expansive than two positions, but the position of folks who support anti-colonial resistance, try to figure out how to align their solidarity and their movements with resistance to colonialism, and a left that actually doesn't do that usually, right? Because it has a kind of national chauvinism, or it connects in with maybe a left-wing politics within those imperial spaces, but not against those that are oppressed by those countries, right? Because that then raises certain contradictions, causes them to kind of have to challenge their own positionality related to these things. So from the Material interview, you say, quote, "My pity extends towards this colonial left. which persists in championing social justice selectively and which culturalizes or pathologizes the outcries of ingenuity of the oppressed Palestinians, thereby ensuring their nocturnal tranquility. This left I pity because it occludes the avenues for organizing, for collective action, for unearthing truths and forging class alliances, for refusing to think and stretch the criteria for the possibility of judgment. It abandons the transformative potential inherent in moments of upheaval by opting to remain outside of the question of belonging to an uprising such as the one that unfolded on October 7th, end quote. So I just wanted to give you space to say a little bit more about this phenomenon.
I mean, that's the central point of my intervention since I started intervening, which is like, it's true that I was responding to people's, takes on things. And generally, I was just provoked in many instances. But, the central thing that provoked me was that, this is an uprising that, yes, we can trace to a decision and a decision maker, to a specific political movement in this instance as well. It's a bit different than the intifadas in that sense. It's not a collective, spontaneous like rupture, but one that is, formed on this kind of guerrilla army that was being created and entrenched in the Gaza Strip. But at the end of the day, it's a moment that reveals a lot. Like, I think, when we look at the student movements, or we look at the media's complicity and participation, or we look at electoral politics in the US, or we look at institutions like universities, or we look at, the entire spectrum of civil society organizations in the West as well, and their position on Palestine, and the moral hypocrisy that permeates a lot of these institutions, and their positions, and their unwillingness to actually exact the price from Israel. Because remember, like, one of the primary elements of the Palestinian call for the past 50 years, it's not only for people to listen to our story and back us and support us, and as much as that is important, but what we wanted from those in the metropole, in the center, is for Israel's impunity to end. Its ability to do anything and everything it wants without consequences, legally, diplomatically, morally, and on the level of economic benefit, to end. We just want these institutions to stop paying or supporting or backing or casting aside Israel's problematic relationship with the Palestinians since its own inception as a supremacist movement on the land of Palestine, where Palestinians existed for thousands of years. And that is, I think, what also is provoking a lot of people now in a lot of different places in the world. Is that what is being provoked is that they can't see their political class acting, they can't see their media class acting, they can't see their representatives in the government acting. And I think that's what is also provoking that desire to engage with Palestine, not only because Palestine is an exception, but I think because Palestine tells us something about the whole systemic forces that we live under, whether in New York or in Pennsylvania or even in Palestine. There's something about Palestine that can reveal things about even your everyday life somewhere else. And I think from the outset, that's what I was trying to also tell people, is that it's not only about us, it's about you understanding under the type of class alliance and system that you live under, and why it has that position over Palestine, and what that means, what it tells you about the history of your institutions, the buried skulls that nobody wants to talk about, the pretensions of these liberal neutral spaces where everybody can speak their mind, except when it comes to Palestine. So there's something here in that exception that tells us something about actually the norm. And the question of belonging to October 7th, it's important. It doesn't mean necessarily that we should morally accept everything that happened on October 7th, or means that we need to be blinded in our support to any political movement. And I mean, even leftist political movements in Palestine, and also sometimes their own regressive practices and problematics as well. I mean, I'm not one to shy from an internal critique or from a critique, whether it's unethical or moral, but this ability to judge so fast things, this kind of, you know, this kind of leftist Western ear that tries its best to find an excuse for Israel, to find something to clinch on. And then when anything Palestinian happens, almost always jumps so easily to condemn the Palestinians, I think tells us something about, you know, its politics and its relation, or dismissing the Palestinians. I mean, I've seen, you know, a lot of Palestine skeptics in the left that are very, you know, oh, the Palestinians have a choice between being laborers for Israelis or being, you know, slaves, or, you know, dying and being killed, and, you know, as if there's no other choice. There's no, you know, choice of also Palestinians liberating themselves or reconfiguring the relation with this colonial power in a significant way. I mean, there's a fundamental problem on, you know, of miscomprehension, misrecognition, and also just outright sometimes Islamophobia, culturalization of Palestinians, looking them as static people with, you know, regressive social practices, and trying to dismiss them, and trying to look at one part of Israel that has been manufactured well as an image, this Tel Aviv liberal hub that, you know, we're so cute and nice, and we have high-rise buildings, and we have a gay community, and we have liberal values, and we are, you know, representative of Western culture in the midst of barbarians and beasts. I mean, that type of politics that also exists on the left, I don't get. I don't think you're a leftist if you're, like, you know, engaged in that type of politics. And I don't know what you are, but you're definitely not, you know, somebody that belongs to or has. I don't want to exclude people from anything, but that belongs to the, you know, to the cries of the oppressed and the cries of the wretched, and you know, have a very hard time, you know, and accepting that type of position myself. But I think it also shows me that there is a problem, not because you should support Palestinians because we need only your support, but because it's also something, it tells you something about, you know, your own world. And perhaps that's what disturbs them, is that they have to confront truths that they don't want to confront. They have to confront realities that are right in front of them that they don't want to confront, or they have some sort of Zionist lineage and they just don't want to, you know, really completely disentangle themselves from that kind of Zionism. And on these fronts, I think, you know, it's good to remember that the founding fathers of Israel were leftists, at least on paper. You know, they had progressive political pretensions, and that a large part of the left, including a large part of, you know, the important philosophers of the 20th century, including somebody like Sartre and others, you know, when it came to Palestine, they just, like, there was a block, and they couldn't treat it in any meaningful way. They had positions on Algeria that are very radical. When it came to Palestine, they became very regressive, you know, whether for cultural reasons or the history of anti-Semitism, or, you know, whether they bought this whole progressive agenda that the kibbutz movement and the initial colonies that, you know, whatever it is that, you know, motivated their own politics of supporting the colonization of Palestine and the dismissal of the Palestinian people, that I think remains well alive in the large parts of the Western left, and it's now articulated with much more nuance, but it's still there. And, you know, we should just be, you know, aware of it, and whenever we can, fight it back. But again, I think October 7th holds something more than Gaza, more than the Palestinian question. It holds something for, I think, a large for the world as well, broadly, and it holds it on two fronts. First is its ability to reveal truths about again many of the institutions and the things that I've just laid out. But I think it also tells us something about, for instance, what it means to accept the form of AI-induced machine killing in Gaza, what it means to the future of warfare in our world. Because one of the things that are always important is this type of boomerang effect from the colony to the metropole, back to the colony. And I was watching a lecture the other day by Khalid Attallah, and he said something that I think struck me as well, which is, Netanyahu once said that, that the West, meaning the West, they will look like us more, so don't worry about them. They will become more like us. So there is a level to that people should take more, I think, seriously, specifically when a lot of Israelis like Yovel Noah Hariri are in the cutting edge of what it means to build an ethical code around AI, taking the Israeli experience that now we're seeing unfolding in front of our screens to the world as a model and then replicating it elsewhere. So there's a level to that universality as well. It's what happens in Palestine doesn't stay in Palestine. It's gonna unfold elsewhere. And the third, I think, element is that what it means to liberate Palestine it means to change the world. That's what we're realizing. It means that on some level the world has to change in a significant way, and that is an actual important leftist agenda. If we're gonna call ourselves leftists, it has a potential that moves beyond just ending Israel's impunity. What is preventing that from occurring will also be a struggle, and that struggle has something to do with also the type of again institutions and world that people live in London and New York and other places across the world, whether in the global north or also, and more importantly, in the global south. Because this is where another part of the thing, now we're having a whole war happening in Sudan. And I recall, like, years ago I was in Italy studying, and an Italian friend was like berating me for being Palestinian and for taking up too much of the news. And I was like, my response was very dramatic, but my response was, that our hope one day is that you'll never hear of us, like on the news, like that would be. But then I explained to him that the only reason why we Palestinians are famous is not because there's anything intrinsic about us, although I like to believe that as well. Like, I like to have some Palestinian chauvinism in me, but there's a level to it, which is, it's, what Mahmoud Darwish has described as who our enemies are. And that is what makes us, for a lot of the world interesting, and where attention is paid more around conflicts that are happening in Palestine than other conflicts, for instance, or other places. Of course, it has also a material infrastructural element where Palestinians, alongside their allies, built like media alliances and institutions, and they're a diasporic community for 75 years. So they're everywhere in the US and Canada, and they have some social capital and symbolic capital, and they use it. But there is an element to that remains, true. And I think, it's important. Despite that I'm speaking to you, and I always assume that I'm talking to people from generally the global north, that this also, the question of Palestine connects well with the history of all the nations that were colonized, but also with what it means to have also a project of liberation that transcends the pitfalls and tragedies of post-colonialism, if we're able to achieve any form of liberation in Palestine. What it means to have, also a progressive form of thinking liberation and imagining it. And I think that's also an important element to the Palestinian cause, and how it connects to a lot of other places, geographies, and its universality on many levels.
Appreciated. I'm gonna get you out of here soon, but I know you gotta smoke your cigarette, and I have to make sure that not my students, my children didn't destroy the house while I've been doing this. But I will pull up a couple things that people asked, because there were a lot of questions today. I appreciate all the folks tuning in and engaging. Um, so there's a lot of good questions.
I mean, I have time, Jared. So if you wanna,
All right.
not in a hurry. I'm smoking anyways, so
Yeah. No, I know you are.
I didn't respect your rule. So,
Yeah,
guys, he was trying to oppress me before we.
Yeah, that's right.
No, I'm joking. I'm just joking.
Well, let's talk. This is a decent question. I mean, we've talked about it a little bit before, but not too much. So somebody asked, what does the engagements of the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade say about the ruptures within Fatah in the West Bank? And are they serious enough to threaten the PA? Somebody responded to this and said there are basically two Fatahs, the PA led by Abbas and the resistant nationalists led by prisoner leader Marwan Barghouti. I'm sure you'll say it's a little bit more complicated than that, because I remember previously I asked a question about this and you said Fatah is not one thing, that it has diversity within it. But yeah, what would you say about those questions?
It's a very, very complicated question, and highly complex, because there's an element to that. There's also not two Fatah, like there's no one Fatah or two Fatah or three or four, or I don't know. So Fatah is it's hard to encapsulate in one sentence, like, so when we say Fatah now, there is an official body that has an official central committee in which Marwan Barghouti, for instance, is part of, that was mentioned, and he's a prisoner in Israeli jails. And Abu Mazen is in, and other parts, other personalities from the Palestinian current political elite are in as well. However, it's a good question, because I wrote a piece 2-3 years ago. I called what was happening in the north of the West Bank a politics of unbinding. And what I was trying to show is that there is a level within the social base that is generally loyal to Fatah and its leadership modality that has been slowly unbinding from the power of that leadership to control the base on an ideological level, but also in terms of the choices people make on the level of whether to engage in resistance or not. And that part of the success of the implanting and the building of a semi-organized armed movement in the north of the West Bank comes actually from resistance forces like Islamic Jihad and Hamas. But in this context, Islamic Jihad was important because Islamic Jihad, unlike Hamas, specifically in the north of the West Bank, in places like Jenin, was actually historically drawn from the Fatah base. So a lot of people who became Islamic Jihad were actually historically Fatah in the 80s, and then, or the 70s, and then in the 80s, late 80s and 90s, moved to Islamic Jihad, which means there's like a social intrinsic relationship between kind of Islamic Jihad and Fatah. Remember, Islamic Jihad, for those who don't know, are they're a group that were formed largely by some people who left the Islamic Brotherhood when they were not Hamas, so before they became Hamas, but also currents that came out of Fatah. So they were kind of this mingling of people coming out of Fatah, seeing something in the Iranian Revolution that held a promise, and seeing Islam as a medium through which you can mobilize Arab and Muslim masses in the region, and mixing it with this anti-colonial, anti-imperial policies that they've took, specifically, as I outlined earlier, this kind of politics of pure resistance. The solution is always resistance. And that made them also non-threatening to political forces that are interested in governance. to a degree. Doesn't mean that there's no fighting and infighting, but because you're already saying I'm not interested in taking, the presidency, and I don't care about, the minister of finance or some sort of privilege within the system or some sort of social capacity, and I don't have a hegemonic project or a social agenda. Islamic Jihad has always been, holds a lot of credibility among Palestinians as a party that is committed only to resistance and nothing but resistance. And in that sense, it was capable of being the head of the spear, in entrenching itself in the north of the West Bank and extracting from within the Fatah social base a lot of people to its cause of building an armed movement in the north of the West Bank. Now, having said that, on the question of Fatah and its relationship to Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades and what Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades are, again, anybody can, in the context of Fatah, issue a statement in the name of Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades. It doesn't take a lot of. There's no, there's no central command and control that, like we see, for instance, in Al-Qassam, that commissions such statements to be made to the public, etc. And it's here important to note that that's part of the lessons that Hamas learned from the history of the PLO. And that was part of also the piece that I was trying to point out, is that people like Hezbollah and Hamas took the PLO as an experiment in what not to do, or what to avoid, and sometimes also what to emulate, or what to exceed, or what to surpass. And that type of relationship is quite intrinsic and important. But in the context of Fatah, any local group, for example, in Balata camp, can just say, I am Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades, or I am. But at the end of the day, if there's any resistance formation, whether in the north of the West Bank or any other place, it has nothing to do with the current political elite, and it's a form of rebellion or unbinding from that elite. And it has, even if it calls itself Fatah or calls itself something else, we're talking about, something that is deeply antagonistic to the current political formation that controls the PA. But I don't think it has any connection to any of the current leaders in a very direct form. But I don't, we never know. I don't think that it's led by Marwan Barghouti or led by somebody else. I think it's just part of this larger formation that folds both, Islamic Jihad, Hamas, Fatah, or other groups in the north, but also surpasses them. That's why we saw names like Lion Den, and Lion Den was, for instance, both, made up of people who maybe belong to political parties ideologically, at least on a level, but at the same time surpass that kind of belonging to create something that transcends those political formations on the basis of a shared common life in the old city of Nablus. So they might be PFLP and Fatah and Islamic Jihad in terms of their orientation, but at the same time doesn't mean that there's an organized central command from PFLP or Islamic Jihad or other. A lot of the resistance movements in the West Bank historically were not a top-down process. And that's important to also note. Sometimes they have that element, but a lot of times they were also bottom-up formations, which means that people organize themselves and then associate themselves with political formations. So it's important to note that it's also always, as I gave that analysis, it's always important that this kind of this kind of notion that there's a kind of a central political party that is organizing things and placing things on the ground is not always that direct and unidirectional. That it's a lot of times there's a long history of cells that do actions, and then where they're caught, then they decide that they join, for instance, Fatah or Hamas or Islamic Jihad, or depending sometimes on political orientations or family members or friendships, or how they decide to associate themselves with which party, or it has sometimes just social connections rather than any kind of ideological commitment to any form of political party. So and part of the armed movement also in the West Bank is a bottom up process, not only a top down process. And but it's indicated, it's symptomatic of this kind of politics and from biting from Fatah. The other thing I will say about Fatah is that if we imagine that there's no bureaucratic apparatus called the PA, then it would be hard to imagine a really energetic or a large big force called Fatah in Palestinian society. Whether in Gaza, by the way, or in the West Bank, or in other place, because I think while Fatah had a long history of the ability to mobilize Palestinians in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it became the biggest political party inside Palestine. It really took its power from the ability to grant people job and to create the conditions of a bureaucracy where people vie for influence within this bureaucracy. And there's kind of this fight over resources that this bureaucracy has within people from Hebron and Ramallah and I don't know, the north and other places, which means that to a large extent Fatah as a political revolutionary party is an idea that exists somewhere on a spectral, if you want, level. But at the same time, in its actual manifestation materially, what sustains Fatah is not, it's not Fatah that sustains the bureaucracy, it's the bureaucracy and its economic prowess that sustains this notion that there is a political formation that is Fatah. And giving some allegiance to a political idea or party comes from that. And you can see it clearly, for instance, in Birzeit's elections, the student elections, where a lot of the students that vote for Fatah are not voting out of conviction, but sometimes out of their parents' job in the bureaucracy, or some sort of belonging, or some sort of like wanting a job after they graduate in the bureaucracy, or wanting to enhance their economic and material condition through that. So there is some of that. I'm not saying that's whole picture, but I think it's important to just note that a large part of what is considered Fatah today has to do with this politics of aid distribution, control of resources and privileges within the bureaucracy. And without that, there would be very little of Fatah left in terms of its ability to summon people or have any form of real power within Palestinian society.
Appreciate the breakdown. Couple things. So one thing, you brought up Islamic Jihad. I do recommend, we had Amid Fela on a while ago and did a good discussion of Fatih Shakaki. So people could check that out. Gives a little bit more of kind of the complexities of some of the things you were laying out, just in terms of the politics, the anti-imperialism, the ideological structures, which I found really interesting. So folks can check out that conversation too. Nader asked this question: what can we understand from U.S.'s position, particularly on discouraging quote unquote illegal migrants, and comparing that to their unapologetic position on encouraging illegal settlers and settlement projects? I mean, I'd take it a little bit further than just the U.S. I mean, I think that this is the question a little bit of what you were talking about earlier, Abdaljawad, for me, around the so-called boomerang, or sometimes people don't like that terminology because they say, well, the US and the West have always been engaged in these genocidal kind of colonial projects around the world, and they also have been engaged in similar sorts of battles against certain populations within their own countries as well. And I mean, I think that the question around illegal, quote unquote, illegal migration in the United States is really concerning right now. I mean, even the fact that like I was looking at polling today actually, and like an overwhelming majority of liberals support the suspension of asylum in the United States at this point. And which is just I mean, a flagrant violation of international law, which I think is also something too that is a deeper, like I don't, and I know I don't think you do either, Aboud, but like I don't put a lot of, there's no faith in me in international law nor belief in it as some kind of liberatory, paradigm or something like that. But I think it is interesting in moments where you see, Israel and the United States so flagrantly opposed within the Democratic Party, which is supposed to be the quote unquote, liberal party in the United States, that again, there's not even a very serious consideration or language around these ideas when they're in power. Like they're really actually quite excited and welcome to say international law doesn't apply to us. It doesn't apply to Israel. We don't really care about it. We're actually okay with sanctioning the bodies that seek to arrest Netanyahu, etc. And I think it comes along the lines of something that you've talked about, Abdaljawad, before, which is like these kind of settler affinities, right? Which is this notion of um, these these states built on settler colonial enterprises or who sponsored settler colonial enterprises, and that this history is not just something in the past, right? That there is still this, there's always a logic within settler colonial societies that says, um, kind of these liberal centers with their democratic norms, and that doesn't apply to us out here in the wilderness dealing with the savages, right? And of course, I'm saying that in scare quotes because that's not how I think about these things at all. But um, I think we see that also with the recent elections in Europe, where you're seeing more and more right wing politics retake hold. You're seeing more anti-immigrant, which is always anti-Muslim, anti-Palestinian sentiment take hold too. And so, yeah, I mean, there's a bigger trend there, I think, in terms of this fact that these two things that you oppose here, they're not actually, they seem in contradiction to each other, but they're really not, because there's a distinction here between people who are migrants and people who are settlers that are a part of an ideological and a capitalist sort of project of accumulation, of defense, of offense posed as defense, against populations that are to be managed, controlled, and killed. And yeah, I don't know if you have anything to say to that, but that's kind of what it makes me think about as you pose that question, Nadir.
I mean, we can make a rhetorical point, specifically from the right. It's the right wing has this kind of like category of people invading us, and in the context of, for instance, immigration from the Muslim world mixed with this Islamophobia of like Muslim coming to England or the US, and the Muslim ban that Trump had. And you can make the point that despite the fact that Muslims in America or in other places or immigrants, they're coming to work and live and largely respect the laws and rules of the country they come to. In the context of settlers, of course, it's a disruptive war of annihilation that is actually conducted on the natives, and where the notion of living with is not at the center of their own politics or the way they view the other. They view them again as a barbarian and an obstacle for their expansionist spatial form of colonization that they want to enact. And on some level, I think that right wing, because it views this kind of spatial movement from one place to another as this act of annihilation, it sees that as something that, when people are coming into the US or other places, as similar, that people are coming here with the intention of, replacing and destroying and disrupting. So I think it's deeply ingrained, psychological fabric that has that, element to it. But I don't know, with the US, being also a settler project, it's also, I think, a form of nativization. No, it's like, these new incomers, they're immigrants, but we're now the natives, and it has that element of, the new declaration of being intrinsic and unbounded and, organic to the land, that largely also in North America was stolen from the indigenous peoples, and, on their expenses. So it has this kind of element of also attempting to nativize the European white settlers that made it into the US 500 years ago, and, created this political formation that is called the United States of America. But of course, I'm not in any way an expert on, migration, people movements, and the relationship with the cartels in Mexico, and the economic disparities, and how imperialism creates the conditions for also people attempting to like survive and create economic mobility through these daring, long journeys that, ends up killing a lot of people also on their way. And on the new policies of borders that are being created, in North Africa, through European incentives, by paying, Morocco and Tunisia and Libya and other countries to prevent the flow of migrants by, creating these camps and sites. And there's a lot of other people that can speak to it in a much more detailed sense to me than I would be able to. But yeah, I think at the end it has this racist core, no? At the end, the white settlers are not immigrants. They're, on an ideological mission to change the world and their image. They view themselves as a project that, will elevate humanity, even if it has to destroy and kill native peoples across the world. Bringing modernity and capitalism to the world and transforming societies, and that is, is seen as a noble, high-minded, rational, civilizing mission that, has always fed a lot of the settlement projects across the world. And when it comes to, brown and oppressed and poor and marginalized people across the world moving, they're always seen as dangerous aliens that need to be either stopped or killed. But of course, in some instances, capitalism in some countries need these migrant workers. And there's a level of confliction between, for instance, Germany opening the door for Syrians because it needs unskilled labor and semi-skilled labor and skilled labor, and to sustain its economic model and system. And between this kind of reactionary white wing politics that is, using that as a means to fuel, again, the rise of this kind of internal other that needs to be rid of, to make life better and to efface the material conditions that are actually created by policies that have nothing to do with the immigrants, but has a lot to do with the form of exploitative capitalist system that exists, whether in Germany or in the UK or in other places. But instead of confronting that, what a lot of these fascist politics do is efface it and turn it onto a racialized form of politics. And a lot of people spoke about that, but there is an ironic twist in it, and there is, of course, a non-morally tenable position, and it has an element of racist, outright racist, outright racist, and outright racist elements within it as well. That's what I would say to it. But like we saw with Israel, and that's one of the things that I think is very revealing as well, is that whenever people have this kind of untenable, inconsistent moral positions, whenever they want to bind specific, forms of fantasy that structure like a reality of something, that it doesn't matter if you're consistent or not. It's it doesn't have to be consistent. I mean, it can be very contradictory. It can be very tense in terms of its, just take an example. For instance, if we're going to take Israel's line of assault on Palestinians seriously, for instance, on the resistance that it's taking Palestinians in Gaza as human shields, or that if we take its AI killing machine seriously in a sense of how the AI machine can produce targets based on highly tenuous links with resistance. For instance, using, I don't know, mobile data to place that, oh, you were close to this resistance fighter for like every month, twice for, an hour. And maybe it's just a coincidence you're both at the same time in the market. And using that to kill Palestinians, to actually target them in their homes with dumb bombs, as a lot of the reporting and investigative reporting is done, is that if you turn it against Israel, if you say, for instance, that, well, is everybody in Israel that has a link to the IDF or the Israeli Defense Forces, the Israeli Occupation Forces, a legitimate target or not? Then even the picture of who was killed on October 7th changes drastically. Israel preserves a right to declare that it has civilians and it has a military, although it's a people's army. But it preserves also the right to create this exception where any tenuous link with anything that has to do with Palestinian resistance is seen as a legitimate target, whether it's schools, hospitals, whether it's people, whether it's... So if you invert that, you slowly can make you can actually legitimize October 7th, even if you have a problem with it, basing it on Israel's own logic, its own mathematical logic of killing, just invert it. But for Israel, it doesn't matter, because us Palestinians, we don't have the right to make these type of claims. It's only them that they have the right to decide who's the terrorist and who's the legitimate fighting force, who's the sovereign and who's the exception. Who holds the right to decide who to kill, when to kill, and how to kill, and who doesn't have that right at all? Who has the right to use armed means to, open political possibilities, and who has the right to have armed means to kill any possibility of... But that doesn't matter in the world of, fascist ideologies more broadly, and Zionism is one version of these fascist ideologies, where you can have highly untenable positions, but at the end, they're based on this very racist and racialized discourses, and it's fine. I mean, you can have you can claim all of Gaza is Hamas and kill all of Gaza through this kind of ideological maneuvering and through this kind of outright lying that the Israelis are conducting, and then cry foul and feel injured that or feel it's illegitimate for Palestinians to view Israelis who are recruited in the army in mass, who have that kind of direct link to their own fighting force, and to cry injury and to make this distinction between civilian and military matter only when it comes to you being targeted. So I mean, I think after 8 months of seeing the rhetorical devices and ideological assaults and tools, again, you don't with these type of political ideologies, they don't need to be in any way morally or politically consistent. But I think what works is to remind them that they're not, and to remind them of their hypocrisy, and to remind the world that they're lying, and creating these forms of untenable positions that have no ground in either logic or in any ethical or moral norms that that binds humanity as such. It has something to do with a politics that is built on walls, on exclusion, on racialization, and on capitalist exploitation, which renders some people more human than others, and therefore some people more killable than others, some people more barbarian than others, some people have more rights than others, and these hierarchies are just sustained. And through these hierarchies and their sustainment, you can have these positions that are completely outrightly outrageous.
Appreciated. Regarding the border stuff and migrants, I do recommend this book a lot for folks. Border and Rule by Harsha Walia. It's excellent. It doesn't necessarily get in that I recall too much, although it may have been a few years since I read it. But the contradiction between, you really have to study settler colonialism also to understand some of the contradictions that happen within settler societies as well. But it's a great book on the proliferation of border technology and the outsourcing of borders to other countries. What you were talking about in terms of like Morocco and Tunisia and these other countries and their role in providing another buffer of bordering for Europe, for instance, and United States. Same thing with Mexico and other countries in Central America, of trying to harden their borders as a way to prevent migration into the U.S. All right, I think I'm gonna leave it there. I appreciate it. I realize I didn't get to everybody's questions, but we have been going for over 2.5 hours, and thank you so much, Abud, again for this discussion. I know that we will do it again. And yeah, thanks everybody for tuning in. Make sure to do again the basics and like the video, subscribe to the channel if you have not already, and share it with folks. And yeah, support us if you want on Patreon. Like I said at the beginning, I'm sure this video is going to get demonetized because of the subject matter. They won't like how much we talked about Hamas. So anyways, appreciated, and everybody have a great day. I should say one more thing is we do have a conversation coming up on Thursday, on which I'm really looking forward to. It's on Malcolm X and his position on Palestine and his time in Gaza, his time in Egypt, and how this influenced him, as well as the position of the Nation of Islam, and how it sort of evolved on Palestine. And this is really important because it represents a break. If you go and you look at most black radical and leftist thinkers prior to Malcolm X and prior to, really a lot of them didn't come around until like 67, that there wasn't support for Palestinians, and there was a lot of support for Zionism, actually. And Malcolm X kind of broke through these logics in a number of ways. And so, we have a scholar, Hamza Baij, and I hope I didn't butcher his last name so much, but I will look that up and make sure I pronounce it better when we interview him. But anyways, I'm looking forward to that conversation and talking about that. So I hope to see you all then, if not before. And thanks again.
Thanks, Jared.